Some of you may remember the date, July 16th, 1969. You remember what that was? And while we may not any longer remember that exact date in our heads, humankind landed on the moon that day. I cannot imagine anyone back then not knowing Neil Armstrong put his feet on the lunar surface. Everyone knew what had happened. And perhaps like that, although devastatingly different, it's hard to imagine anyone in this valley not being in touch with and absorbed by the catastrophic fire that began this last week. And for those of you who are visiting, I'm sure this has not been such a great time to be here as well. Many in this valley, and for some who are part of this chapel family, this week has really been a living hell. It's been brutal. Whether due to evacuation, being on alert to evacuate, being a business owner, suffering lost revenue at a critical income earning time of year, losing a home, suffering from anxiety or fire-related phobias, or being a child not knowing how to come to terms with all that is scary. These last days have been simply awful and traumatic for a lot of people in this valley. And just think what the countless firefighters and other first responders have been going through. I, along with our team, have been in touch with many people during the course of the last few days. And you need to know also that among those evacuated are 3 staff members, Ashley and her family, along with Paul and Miha. Just a quick story about Paul and Miha. Last week, when Paul and Miha arrived at our house to spend the night due to being evacuated, I was delighted to see that they had brought along their 3 pet chickens. I'd never met pet chickens before. Paul, can you stand up and give us the chickens' names, please?
So they're the women of the Intergalactic Senate. We have Senator Tinra Pamlo, Chancellor Manmafma, and Queen Padme Amidala.
Despite those wonderful names, I will never look at grilled chicken ever the same way. And Paul and Miha and I have been having lots of chicken chuckles over the last few days. The stupid jokes just continue. If only all of life were so light. A number of years ago, I was living in an apartment in Los Angeles, and I won't forget the night a knock came on the door, and the police told me to get out immediately to do a fire in an adjacent building. The only thing I could do was leave. I had to leave immediately with them. And as I left, I felt panic, stress, unhappiness, sadness, and a ton of fear. When I think about that night so long ago, my blood pressure still rises, and so does my heart rate. I remember all too well the deafening silence of the news because there seemed to be no news in the midst of all that was happening. A day later, I was allowed to go home. My apartment was intact, which was not the case for the 5 people who lost their lives. The whole thing still haunts me if I let it. I know over the years that event was one of many in my life that have prompted me to review what is most important when it's all said and done. And sometimes when we are shaken to the core, such questioning happens, which strangely enough can really be beneficial and a blessing. At least that fire event in LA and other traumas in my life have been part of my journey in discovering what is worth holding on to and what really doesn't matter much when it's all said and done. But ultimately, such questions and answers are for each of us to work out with ourselves, others, and with God. One of our readings today is from the well-known story in the Gospel of Matthew. What a day it had been for Jesus. The day starts for Jesus with the bad news that his very close friend, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. John's mom and Jesus' mother, Mary, were related. They had a close relationship from the beginning. And it is John, who baptized Jesus, and it's clear that John and Jesus were very close, and they had a relationship that was very important to them both. So when Jesus gets the news that John had been beheaded, it's a tough moment for him. We learn in Matthew that Jesus, in response to John's death, decides to go off to be alone in a remote area. we can assume that he needed some time alone with few distractions to grieve the loss of his friend. But instead of finding some peace and solitude, people found out where Jesus was headed, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by thousands and thousands of people. People who were searching for meaning, searching for the point of life, searching for the purpose of life, searching to see this miraculous healer, searching to understand a life that didn't always make much sense. So here Jesus finds out that his friend is dead. He goes off to be alone. All of a sudden, thousands of people are finding him, following him, and things get busy. And this led to the feeding of the 5,000, which I won't get into today, other than just to say that it is a feeding in which Jesus, with a few loaves of bread and fish, miraculously fed hordes of people who were hungry at a late hour in the day. Immediately after this event, in the evening, Jesus tells his disciples who are with him, "I'd like you to get into a boat and cross the Sea of Galilee," which is an inland lake, a massive lake. And after he tells them to get into a boat and to cross the sea, Jesus heads up to the hills to be by himself, finally, to be able to find some alone time and to grieve John's death. During this time, however, a massive storm hits the lake, and the disciples in their boat are tossed around. And like Gilligan and the skipper, too, I assure you, the last thing they expected was to hit a storm. But they did, and it was a bad storm, a very bad, bad storm. And as they're in the midst of this terrible situation, Jesus suddenly appears walking across the water toward them. And needless to say, they are terrified not only because of the storm, but because they think Jesus is a ghost. And immediately, Jesus says to them, "Do not be afraid. I am here." Now, before going on, a brief word about being human. You and I are flesh and blood. We have hearts, we have minds, we have feelings, thank God. To not feel, to be immune of the pain of other people, or to believe that we should deny our own tough stuff is the antithesis of what I believe God wants from us. Is God made us to feel. And sometimes fear, panic, hopelessness, worry, concern, and despair is part of what it means to be a human being, even a person of faith. And such reactions are absolutely normal and to be expected when flames are lapping at your door and threatening the lives of those you love. Of course we're afraid. We'd have to be robots not to react when threats are real, massive, and overwhelming, whether due to a fire or some other bad, scary life event. And yet, in the midst of all of that, Jesus came to his disciples, and he comes to us, and he says, "Do not be afraid. I am here." Notice in this story what Jesus does not do. It's critical to notice what he does not do. He doesn't chastise the disciples for being afraid. He responds to their fear. And there's a difference between chastising someone for a feeling and responding to a feeling. Jesus did not come across the water that night and say, "How dare you have feelings? What's wrong with you? What's your problem? You should have no distress as a follower of me. You know I can take care of things. You shouldn't be overwhelmed. Come on, show some toughness." Jesus says nothing of the sort. His immediate words are, "Do not be afraid. I'm here." Well, why does Jesus respond this way? Well, I believe it's because God knows exactly how we were made, as I just said, to be caring, feeling, empathizing, loving, giving people, and such people like you and me will have fear. And when fear happens, God comes to us and says, "Do not be afraid, I am here." I also believe God invites us to explore our fears when we encounter them across different circumstances in life. Now, quick caveat. Many people in this valley right now are in the midst of a crisis. Many are afraid and hurting, whether due to the fire or some other life circumstance. And I think it's critical for me to say that when we're in the midst of a crisis, it's not time to sit down and really deeply evaluate our fear. But rather, it's a time to call out to God, "God, I'm afraid. God, I'm overwhelmed. God, I'm uncertain. God, it seems unpredictable. God, I'm helpless. God, help me. I need you. I don't know what to do. Help me." But when we're not in that crisis, I have found, and so many of you have found, that exploring fear can be a helpful teacher. Because fear can teach us about who we are, what we value, what we rely and depend upon, and where we put our hope and trust. Fear can be one way that God works to get our attention to explore fear with God and with others. But again, not during or in the midst of a crisis. So let's now look at Paul's letter to the Philippians. What a magnificent letter. This was an easy choice for this situation this week. Paul wrote this letter likely from a prison cell. Maybe some of you have been there. It's not far from the Vatican. You can still go there. And certainly that prison cell did not have a bed, electricity, running water, but it was dark and it was dank. And Paul was in that dark, dank prison cell waiting to find out if he was going to be executed. That's the context of this letter. But aside from that, beside this moment of being in jail, waiting to find out if he was going to be executed, Paul had been through so much in his life. He knew pain, he knew fear, he knew guilt, because for a lot of his life he got it totally wrong. He knew guilt, he knew shame, he knew tough times. And with all this background and with sitting in this cell, Paul writes the words that we heard today. Paul writes, "Do not worry about anything. Tell God what you need. And in the midst of telling God what you need, remember to thank God for all that God has done in your life. Not as a way of denying the pain that you're in right now, but as a way of thanking God in the midst of it all for all the good that has certainly happened in your life. But tell God what you need. And when you do this, when you tell God what you need and you thank God for what God has done in your life, you will experience God's peace that exceeds anything," Paul writes, as he's waiting to hear whether or not he's going to be executed. And Paul goes on to write, "I have learned the secret of living in every single situation, including this prison cell." And Paul writes, "I have learned that I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. This I say even in the midst of my present situation." Notice that, like Jesus, Paul does not criticize or chastise the Philippian people for going through tough times or for having emotions. Paul does not write to the Philippian people, following Jesus should be all happy and good with no problems. He does not say, Philippian people, repress your emotions as a human being and feelings and concerns. Would you just get over being human? Paul doesn't say any of that. Instead, he says, whatever is happening, turn to God. Tell God what you need. And in the midst of telling God what you need, thank God for what God has done for you in your life. And remember, you can do everything. You can get through anything through Christ who will give you the strength you need. I think this reading is pretty relevant for those here today who are in a bad place, whether due to the fire or other life travails like physical and mental health issues, family crises, relationship issues, livelihood problems, or some kind of challenge with those we love and care about. These words are spot on. God says to us, yes, you are wonderfully made. You are a human being with hearts that feel and care just as I made you. But remember as a human being that when things are hard, your emotions are okay and to be felt and to be expressed with intensity toward me and with others. Yet know that in the midst of it all, you can do everything. You can get through anything through me, as I will give you the strength you need. So I want to close this morning with this brief story. It was another bad day, September 11th, 2001. We all know where we were. I was serving a large urban parish in Concord, New Hampshire. And many in the parish had family members, especially young adults, who worked in the towers. In addition to responding to their grief and pain, a couple days after 9/11, I went to the hospital, as I did many times a week, making rounds, visiting folks from our parish. And one person I visited was named Robin. Robin had just given birth to a baby boy named Andrew. And as I entered the room, the hospital staff was attending to Robin and baby Andrew. And as I walked in, I was filled with just a ton of emotion as I heard the sounds that only a newborn baby can make. And as a dad, I find those sounds to really be something. Not at 2 o'clock in the morning, but I still find those sounds to be something. Anyways, I entered the room and heard these sounds. CNN was in the background with the round-the-clock coverage of New York. You all remember that. And as I approached Robin and baby Andrew, I caught views of scenes from New York on CNN out of my peripheral vision. And when I stood near Robin and baby Andrew, for some reason my eyes started wandering up to the television. And soon my eyes returned to focus back on Robin and baby Andrew. And then I noticed something strange happening. I was looking at baby Andrew and Robin, and then I would look at the television screen directly. I was just going back and forth between the two. It was then that I realized that my vision, my attention, was going back and forth between life and death, between hope and despair, between innocence and evil, between what is right and what is unspeakably wrong. But then I stopped altogether looking at the news and simply gazed at baby Andrew, that precious child. And it was then that one of those powerful experiences which sometimes happen to us happened. And I was completely overcome and filled with a poignant realization that God, who created all there ever was, came into this world in exactly the same way that baby Andrew entered into the lives of Robin and her family. It was then that it just hit me once again, but in a very poignant way, as I looked at baby Andrew, that our all-powerful God chose to thrust himself vulnerably into the world in order to be in the midst of our vulnerability and all that it means to be human, feelings, fears, and all. And at that moment, I was reminded very powerfully that through the birth of Jesus, God came in person into the rubble and the fires of our lives in the flesh in order to say to us firsthand, "Here I am. Do not be afraid." And as I reached for baby Andrew's tiny hand, I realized then, and I know now, that there is absolutely, without question, whether we sense it or not, there's another hand reaching out to each of us here today and those we love in the midst of whatever it is we're enduring, whether a fire or some other god-awful crisis. It is Jesus who is reaching out for you right now. It is Jesus who is saying to you and to me, "Here I am, do not be afraid. Tell me what you need. Trust that you can do all things through strength, my strength, that you can make it through anything with my strength. Here I am, do not be afraid." I'm sorry about the fire in the valley happening and the fires all over the West. I feel terrible for those who have been directly affected, not only locally, but all over the West. I'm sorry that life sometimes just sucks. That sometimes it's just plain bad. But when we're in those times, I pray and pray and pray for all of you, and I pray for me too, that I will remember, that you will remember Jesus' words as he walked across the Sea of Galilee. "Do not be afraid, here I am." I pray that we will turn to and trust Paul's words in his letters to the Philippians. Tell God what you need. And there's something else I pray too. And that is, in the midst of whatever's going on, I hope we will look at and be attentive to a great sign of the presence of the Spirit of God. And that is the countless people who have been and who continue to step up to selflessly help anyone and everyone in need in this valley. It's really amazing, the number of people that are stepping up to help. And what I love about it is that it's, whether or not they know it, it's very Jesus-oriented, because they're helping anyone and everyone. They don't know anything about them because they have no reason to be prejudiced against them for any reason. People are helping anyone and everyone the way it should always be. Whether blue or red or tall or short, nasty and mean or sweet and kind. Whatever our life looks like, we should be helping anyone and everyone. And the fire, despite its horrendous consequences, is giving people a reminder that we need to help anyone and everyone. And that's really a miraculous, beautiful, wonderful thing. And it's a marvelous display of something that is so wonderfully right in this troubled world. It's just amazing to see people reaching out. It's a reminder to me that so many people are good. I think we should all just turn off the news. So many people are really good. So many people are really wonderful. And when it's all said and done, so many people are living selfless lives of giving as God intended for us all to live. Thanks be to God. Turn to Jesus. Tell him what you need. And know that I, along with our team, are here to help you now and in this journey in life more generally, whoever you are, wherever you are, in the midst of whatever it is that is not right. Know that we are here for you. And I have to say, as a staff, we are so glad that you're here for us too. Because it works all the way around. So thank you. I still can't remember the names of those darn chickens. Intergalactic what? Intergalactic Senate. Let's pray.